started playing Fireball Frostwall as a way to salvage my broken cast on Free Stormweaver, and since then, I've been adjusting and improving the build over the past few days. And I have to say, it's really good. I've done some tier 15 maps, they're super easy for me. I've killed the pinnacle bosses Eshed, and I got my 4th Ascendancy. So, all in all, I would call this very successful. Warning, this is an endgame build with a lot of complex mechanics. If you don't have enough spirit, if you don't get your mana right, things are going to feel bad. So, I highly recommend you watch the entire video from start to finish before deciding on if you want to play the build or not. So, without further ado, the first thing, mana sustain. Why is it so bad on this build? Well, it probably has something to do with the fact that spells just cost a lot of mana, like 300 plus, and I'm not even an Archmage build. Part of me thought maybe I could add Archmage for damage, but I feel like the mana would just be a nightmare. So, there are a few things, and by a few things, I mean a lot that I've done for this. First, try and get mana regen on gear. Second of all, getting a mana flask that has a prefix for increased amount recovered. Very important. Third of all, getting mana on kill on all of my jewels, so I get 8% of max mana on kill. Fourth of all, dropping Flame Wall, because Flame Wall added a good bit of damage, and it also added a lot of mana costs, and it was literally griefing me. So I ended up dropping that. And last but not least, using a wand with the mana drain skill, because on bosses, unfortunately, all the other things weren't quite enough. So, all that together is how I solved my mana, and now it feels really comfy. Now, the second very big thing, this is a Chaos Inoculation build, meaning you become immune to all Chaos damage and you do not need Chaos Res in exchange for giving up all your life. So, you need to get a health pool from stacking Energy Shield on your gear. This means the build is incredibly gear aligned. Now, personally, I made the swap when I was in yellow maps, and I found that I needed around 5 to 5.5k Energy Shield to feel comfortable. In addition to this, you don't have an Energy Shield flask. So, the important Energy Shield recovery mechanics are Recharge and Grim Feast. Grim Feast gives you Energy Shield when you kill enemies. This is why the build needs a very specific amount of spirit. Energy Shield Recharge starts if you avoid damage for a certain amount of time. Now in Path of Exile 1, this made it a somewhat suboptimal mechanic unless you got the recharge delay really low. But in Path of Exile 2, you can just roll around like a maniac, and as long as you don't get hit, your recharge starts, which feels really good. Just don't roll over ground effects or degens, as those will continue to damage you, thus delaying the recharge. But once you get the hang of it, I've personally found that Energy Shield feels really good, because my current Energy Shield pool is close to 9,000, and with that I can tank most boss abilities I've encountered, though do keep in mind, in Pinnacle encounters, some things will hit way too hard for you to tank, and certain bosses have literal insta-kill moves, so don't try to go tank those. If you're wondering when should you swap from a leveling build to this build, I would say when you have roughly 4 to 5k Energy Shield, or maybe more like 6 to 7k if you're already in red maps. If you try to swap to this during the campaign, it may go well, it may not. Just do that at your own risk, and keep in mind that I really don't recommend it. Then we get to Spirit, which is another point where the build has pretty strict requirements. You get 100 Spirit from completing the campaign, so that is your baseline that everyone has. But this build requires 210, meaning you have to get 110 from gear. There are a couple ways to do it, but the TLDR is, you need a lot of spirit on your amulet and you need a lot on your chest. So chest pieces go up to 60 spirit with a perfect roll. If you had 60 spirit on your chest piece with a perfect roll, then you would only need 50 on your amulet. Amulets have the option for a solar amulet, which, with a perfect roll, I believe goes up to 54, although don't quote me, I would have to double check on that. But let's just say it's 50 plus 15 from the base, that is 65, meaning you'd only need a mere 45 on your chest piece. Exactly how you get it between your amulet and your chest really doesn't matter. The thing that absolutely does matter is that you have 110 additional spirit between your amulet and your chest. And if you aren't able to do this, then I recommend not running the dual curse setup. I think you lose a lot less from a build by cutting either the defensive effect of Temporal Chains, because you already slow enemies with Chill, or the offensive effect of Frostbite, because you already lower enemy resistances using Frost Bomb, than you do losing either Grim Feast or Elemental Invocation. I would keep those. Those together only require 90, and going from the 90 to the 150 required to run single curse is honestly really easy, either through your amulet or your chest piece. So now let's take a look at the gear, passive tree, and skills in a little more detail. Here is my passive tree. Now for my Ascendancy, first up I took Scouring Winds. This lowers the base enemy resistance by an additional 20% when you apply exposure. By default it's 20, so with this it goes to 40. This, combined with all of the exposure effect magnifying things that I have on my passive tree, and from quality on my Frostbomb, and from the support on my Frostbomb, means that I am lowering enemy resistances by 86%, which is really good and allows me to deal way more damage to tanky bosses. It also means when I run a map that says enemies have increased elemental resistances, that's not really a big deal either. Next up, strike twice, so targets can be affected by 2 shocks into Shaper of Storms. If you don't have your 4th Ascendancy, this is absolutely the way to go. This means all of your damage can shock enemies. In other words, your fire damage, not that you have very much of it, and your cold damage can inflict shock, causing enemies to take increased damage. This also means by stacking shock magnitude, you get an additional damage multiplier. And this feels really, really good. Currently, my big shocks from my Lightning Warp cause enemies to take 50% increased damage each, and my little shocks from my regular hits, admittedly a little less Fireball and a little more Frostwall and Comet, cause enemies to take 35% increased. And last up, for my 4th Ascendancy, right now I have Constant Gale, because cast speed feels good, and the mana regen helps to fix my mana problems. With that said, I don't think this one is very much set in stone, and if you don't have any mana issues at all, you could always take Heart of a Storm for extra defenses by recouping some of your damage taken as Energy Shield. In theory, if you wanted to Screen Clutter, I guess you'd go Tempest Caller, but don't do that. It's terrible. This build doesn't stack nearly enough crit to make it work. Or more realistically, you could get Heavy Snows, which slows enemies far more effectively, especially when you're dropping comets on their heads. Basically, think of it this way: damage and quality of life, just defense, defense and quality of life. Now, the rest of a tree can effectively be summed up by, I wanted all the ES nodes, the cold damage nodes, and I took other damage nodes that were nearby. So I'm now going to go over each of the major wheels and what they do. From the start, you get access to a lot of really good energy shield stuff. This is insanely strong, and getting additional stun threshold from your energy shield is really good because it means stuns aren't a thing. Stuns are super annoying. If you get stun locked, you're probably going to die. So not only is dampening shield really good, but asceticism is super, super, super nice. Depending on your ES pool and the content you're running, it's not necessarily strictly mandatory. In theory, you could probably get away with just adding as additional stun threshold, but I really wouldn't advise it because it is nice to just pretend that stuns don't exist in the game. Now near the start, there's also some really good energy nodes like Insightfulness and Melding. Yeah, it's a little bad to get the 10% reduced max mana, but it gives so much defense that it's absolutely worth the sacrifice. You can kind of think of these as health nodes that you get to allocate on the tree. The more energy shields you have, the greater your health pool. And the more energy shield nodes you have, the more effective the energy shield on all of your items, particularly on your focus or your shield and on your helmet. Then over here, Essence Infusion, really good recharge node. You get faster start of recharge and additional recharge rate, so your energy shield comes back faster. Good example of this, the delay is a base of 4 seconds with a 133% delay modifier. I'm guessing that cuts it roughly in half, so 2 seconds, and about 3,000 a second, meaning 3 seconds to fully charge energy shield. Really, really, really good to have. Then over here, Exploit the Elements is just a really good damage node, and the chance to inflict elemental ailments on rares and uniques means your shocks are going to be way more consistent. Over here, Royal is quality of life. Spell skill, area of effect. Bigger area of effect means it is easier to hit and damage enemies with the explosions from your Fireball, the explosions from your Frostwall, and your comments. Since almost everything this build does is an AoE, AoE nodes are really good. And coming down here, alternating current is mana regeneration rate and increased shock magnitude. The shock magnitude in particular is a way to scale your damage, in addition to all the other ways the build has. And over here, Echoing Frost and Echoing Thunder, about 60% increased elemental damage, which is a really nice bonus. You're always going to be shocking and freezing. I was trying Echoing Flames with Flame Wall, but I found that was griefing my mana, so I have since removed the node. I was trying to see if I could still ignite stuff by dropping comets, as you do get a little bit of fire damage, but sadly, that was in no way consistent. It was like, I'd ignite one thing occasionally, so I really don't think it's worth it. Next up, Psychic Fragmentation. Chance for spell skills to fire 2 additional projectiles. This is a chance for your fireball to fire 2 additional projectiles. It stacks up to about 30%. On the one hand, when it procs, especially with wild shards, it feels really good. On the other hand, when it doesn't proc, it feels really meh for this many points. So I'm not 100% sold on these nodes, but I've been using them so far, and I've been liking them. Also, it's free damage for no mana cost, and free damage for no mana cost is also pretty nice. Then you have this. Pathing all the way to Chaos Inoculation. Max life becomes 1, you are immune to chaos damage. But Chaos Inoculation is the core of the build's defenses, so you absolutely need it. Then, Shattered Crystal, reduce Ice Crystal life. This makes the Ice Crystals much easier to detonate. You need your Fireball to be able to quickly and easily detonate the Ice Crystals from your Ice Wall. Otherwise, the main damaging combo for the build doesn't work. So, I would call this a very mandatory node. And then Dreamcatcher for some spell damage and increased energy shield from equipped focus. In short, increased energy shield from equipped focus means this gives a ton of energy shield. So your focus should have a good yes roll as a priority. Then coming over here, Climate Change, increased freeze buildup and 25% of cold damage as extra fire. This makes your burst window much, much better. Now, this is one of those things where I was really hoping the fire damage would do more. It doesn't, so it is what it is. Then Overexposure and Stormbreaker, you get a good bit of damage since you are shocking and freezing, and also chilling. And then Overexposure, increase exposure effect to better strip enemy resistances. Here, Heavy Buffer, for reduced life doesn't matter because life is 1, so it's just 40% free ES. And Illuminated Crown, 70% ES from the helmet, meaning, again, big ES pool. These nodes are really, really, really good for big ES pool. Then up top, Refocus for energy shield recharge rate, all the cold stuff for cold exposure effect, level of cold skills, and freeze duration, far more important than the freeze buildup. Last but certainly not least, Whispers of Doom, so that the build can use both Blasphemy, Temp Chains for defenses, and Blasphemy Frostbite for damage. Now, in terms of jewels, the far more important thing than the individual stats on each is to keep in mind how you use jewels in this build is to solve problems, like mana, mostly mana. So, recover 2% on mana, I would say that is a mandatory mod on all of your jewels. After that, you want things like Energy Shield, so your defenses are better, or Energy Shield from equipped focus. Then, damage mods. Meta skills gain increased energy to drop more comets, increased elemental damage, increased spell damage, increased area of effect. Curse area of effect is a little bit of damage, but also a lot of quality of life. And so that's what I've gone for. Keep in mind this crit spell damage bonus. Not really crit build, but cold spells do have pretty high crit chance, so it's something. Increased area of effect and freeze buildup. The freeze buildup, it's okay. Freeze duration would be a lot better. Ink AoE is very good. This one, again, meta skills, spell damage, energy shield. Solving problems, and it's giving bonuses. I feel really confident in this tree overall now. The only nodes that I'm not 100% sure of are these. They feel really good sometimes when they proc. They feel kind of meh when they don't. And remember, this one's kind of optional, so swap it around as you need. Next up, gearing. Starting with Blue Flame Bracers. You need these for the build to function because these are what causes your fireball to deal cold damage. If you do not have Blue Flame Bracers, the build does not work. So, this is number one most important item. But there are a lot of important items here. as tends to happen with fully developed endgame builds. Next up, the wand. Go for things like damages extra cold, damages extra fire, or damages extra lightning. Cold is the best because that's for resistance you are setting super far into the negatives, but technically extra lightning or extra fire is still extra damage. Spell damage and cold damage are also very, very good stats, so try to get those. For your suffixes, you want +4 to level of all spell skills, and then pretty much anything you can get. Spell crit chance, spell crit damage bonus, chance to shock. Maybe if you're feeling really creative, get something like cast speed, which is very good for quality of life, or some mana regen. But honestly, if your wand just has damages extra cold, all spell skills, you're pretty much 90% of the way there, and you have a really solid weapon. Next up, on rings, these are problem solvers. So if you are missing a resistance, get it on a ring. If you need more mana, which I do recommend as that makes the mana sustain better, get it on a ring. In short, you want resistance suffixes, mana prefix. Again, if you can get something like item rarity, that's good. It makes your loot better. If you can get cast speed, that's quality of life. If you can get mana regen, that's pretty nice. I would recommend a good mana regen roll on one ring, but I haven't felt the need to get it on both. In terms of buying rings and costs, I found that 2 really good suffixes and 1 good prefix was a lot more cost effective than trying to go for 3 suffixes and also a good prefix. Now, if you get things like cold damage as a prefix, also really good. So, belt is another problem solver slot. Get things like resistances. Also, you can get strength here. You need strength for the blue flame bracers, so I would highly recommend getting it on your belt. This means you don't have to worry about rolling it on something like your rings or your amulet or the rest of your gear, which would be really difficult because then you'd need to use an armor ES base rather than pure ES. So, I don't recommend using armor ES on this build. I recommend going pure ES, meaning it's very easy to get it on your belt. In terms of mods that aren't strictly required but are very nice to have, max mana. The better your max mana, the better your mana recovery, because 2% on kill per jewel, 8% on kill, scales with your max mana, plus increased flask mana recovery rate makes your mana flask far more effective, and again feels really, really good. This belt is pretty much as good as it gets, at least in my opinion. Who knows, maybe I'll replace it with a headhunter later. On boots, you want at least 20% move speed, ideally 25 or 30%, because moving around feels really, really good the more movement speed you have. And then after that, as much ES as possible. I've got 342, which is pretty damn solid. These boots have been very hard to replace. I've been trying to get a 30% move speed pair. Basically, what I was doing is buying a pair with an open prefix and slamming, and slowly the price has gone up and up and up on those bases. Maybe in part because I made a video talking about how I was doing this stuff, which by the way will be linked up in the card down below. You can watch it after this. But yeah, in short, nothing too fancy here. Don't worry too much about the suffixes. I mean, if you're attribute starved, int is good. Having a res is good. Stun threshold feels really nice, but the prefixes are really where it's at. Especially because movement speed is kind of a little bit rare. Then, for your helmet, this is where I would recommend getting attributes or resistances. In my case, I have fire and lightning res. Then, for my prefixes, I got a whole bunch of energy shield, 366. Remember, this is magnified by an additional 70%, as opposed to, say, what's on your boots, because, remember, you are also getting extra value from the node on your tree, which is right here. 70% increase in energy shield from equipped helmet. So the ES value is really important. You're going to notice a huge difference in your effective health with a 250 ES helmet versus a 350 ES helmet. Oh, and by the way, the same is very much true of your focus, because at 300 ES, this is massively amplified by the bonuses on the tree and on jewels. There's a lot of damage stats on focus though, so this is another item that can get a bit pricey, and the stats are very demanding. Because you want res, you want level of all spell skills, you want cold damage, and you want ES. I think if there's anything here that gets sacrificed, it's probably either the res or the cold damage, as buying something exactly like I have on now could easily run you 100 exalts up. This was not that expensive. I actually bought it really cheap because it was missing, I forget if it was missing the cold damage or the energy shield. It was missing something that I slammed. That's the important part of the story. I forget exactly what it was. And you know what? Sometimes you find stuff like that. But if you get +2 to level of all spell skills with like 250, 300 ES, it's going to feel really good. Next up, the amulet. You need spirit on it. And you need spirit on your chest. Remember, you need to get to 210 spirit for all the auras on the build to work. So that is priority number 1. After that, get increased maximum energy shield, because amulets can go up to like 50% and you can get like 60 flat ES as a prefix. This isn't quite perfect in that regard, but it has really good resist and cast speed, which is a nice quality of life, so I'd say it's really worth it. I ended up getting this pretty early on. I don't really know how much they cost now. Just know that you don't need these exact stats. If it has like the same spirit, but none of a res, you could get the res elsewhere, like on your boots. You could get the res elsewhere, like on your chest. Just as a note, because this is an endgame build, and because everything's kind of really tightly in balance or equilibrium, every time you lose res on one slot, you need to be thinking about, how am I going to make up for it on a different slot, and how much is that going to cost me? And then for chest piece, in addition to the spirit, you want 2 energy shield prefixes. This is why I have so much res elsewhere on my gear, so that I don't have to worry about getting res suffixes on the chest. It's certainly something that's doable, it's certainly something that's possible, but that's more expensive. So I have like 600-ish ES, feels really good, provides a ton of defenses. 87, 59. Yeah, it's 2.7k ES just from the chest piece alone. And again, I used similar methods to what I did for my other items, which you can see in my How I Made 500 Exalts video. So that is a lot of the gear. Quick overview. Your damage slots are your wand and your focus. Those are basically all your damage slots. So pay attention to the level of all spell skills, damage is extra, and spell damage or cold damage on these items. Your primary resistance slots, that are easier to get, resistances and also attributes to be fair, ring and belt. These commonly roll as suffixes, and you don't really need too many other stats on those items. For boots, you need movement speed, and then you want ES. For helmet, ES, and you're probably going to want to have res here. For amulet, spirit is a must, and after that you want ES and res. Blue flame is mandatory. For chest piece, spirit, ES, and res if you can get it. And for charm, I'm using a thawing charm because it feels really good to be unfrozen and it feels really bad to be frozen. And then an ultimate mana flask with charges gained per second. This is important for sustain on boss fights, and also increased amount recovered so that it actually moves the pool, because I have 1.2k ES and massive spell costs. So next up, skills. First, you got Frostbomb. This creates a little circle on the ground that pulses, and this is really good at stripping away enemy resistances. For supports, I've got Strip Away to make it even better at applying exposure, Concentrated Effect so it does more damage, and Elemental Focus so it does even more damage. This means it can't shock or freeze, but plenty of other things are going to be shocking and freezing anyway, so this felt like a really good middle ground to balance out all the damage, and because the build has so much extra AoE, the Conk Effect doesn't feel too bad. Next up is Frostwall. This is part of the Frostwall Fireball combo. So you put down Frostwall, then at close or even point blank range, you shoot fireballs through it, exploding the walls, causing a lot of fireball projectiles to explode and deal massive damage to enemies. The most important support you can put on your Frostwall is Spell Cascade, because this means you get more walls, and they all kind of just stack up together, overlapping bosses. For damage, you can technically do Conk Effect, but I found, especially while mapping, some of the wall segments exploding weren't hitting enemies if I had Conk Effect, so instead, I'm using Cold Mastery. Keep in mind, you have to have enough damage to break the walls with Fireball, Icicle to make it easier to break the walls, and Rising Tempest, which is a 24% more damage multiplier, because Frost skill, Fire skill. In theory, if you toss Lightning Warp in, it goes up even more, but I'm not using that too frequently. I don't actually know what Elemental Invocation counts as. I don't know if it counts as using the Comet, or using the Elemental Invocation, which is Fire, Cold, and Lightning, which would get you an even bigger damage bonus. As a note, if you're struggling, you can use Glaciation for freeze buildup, or you can increase the freeze duration for enemies frozen by the Frost Wall. This is a little bit lower damage, but it makes walls easier to break and gives them powerful utility. The Fireball, the magic sauce, is Scatter Shot for additional projectiles. That's why you see so many. Well, also because the passive tree procced. Wild Shards, sometimes it fires in a Nova. Let's, like that. Unleash, so that you shoot multiple fireballs from one cast. This is because you are not chain casting Fireball. You are instead going Frostwall Fireball. And Controlled Destruction for more damage. I found this to be very reliable, and at 7% base crit, my Fireball wasn't critting anyway, so it's not really a damage loss. Now, Lightning Warp, you cull enemies when they have a little circle over their head and explode their bodies. Overcharge means the shock goes up to 50%. It's really good. Soul Drain for a little bit of mana when culling, and Shock Siphon for a little bit of energy shield. These are not in any way mandatory, so don't worry about them if you need the support slots for something else. Now, in terms of spirit skills, Grim Feast recovers energy shield on kill. This is really, really nice, especially because this gives you overshield. So, when mapping, instead of having 8.7 KES, if you haven't taken damage for a while, you have 16. And then you stand in something bad, and your ES doesn't move because it just burns off some of your overshield. This is a huge defensive boon, and it feels really good. I actually think, after playing the build for a while, if you don't have the 210 spirit, you still take Grim Feast, you still take Invocation, you cut one of the Blasphemy curses, either Temp Chains or Hypothermia. Now, in terms of damage auras, it is Elemental Invocation. This charges up as you freeze and shock enemies. And it gives you a button that you can press to drop a comet on an enemy's head. In terms of supports, Spell Echo causes the comet to fire twice. The Invocation with quality has 2 charges, which means 4 comets. Inspiration means that you don't cry at the mana costs, because it's 332 or about 660 mana. Or, if I do this, yeah, 1,100 mana. Kind of ridiculous. And then considered casting for more damage because the cast speed penalty doesn't matter. So yeah, free damage. Then last up, Blasphemy. This is a dual purpose aura for damage and defenses. Defensively, Temporal Change slows enemies, making it easier to dodge their attacks. This is particularly helpful as long as you stay in Blasphemy range on bosses. And also Hypothermia. After the curse effect penalty from Blasphemy, this only ends up being like 20-something% more damage. But hey, it lowers enemy resistances by about 20-something%, which is really good because it feels great when clearing to not have to drop Frostbomb and strip resistances. And then on bosses where you are dropping Frostbomb anyway, it's not quite the 20% damage because bosses have resistances. There's a bunch of math behind it. TLDR, more damage good. Now, I know that was a lot. And if there's anything you are confused about, if you have any questions, I highly recommend that you use the timestamps to rewatch sections of a video. But on the other hand, if you feel like you understand everything, it's really good, you're on a good track, and you just want to remember what passives to click, then head over to my planner at MaxwellGG, click through, and you can see everything laid out. I may ultimately add a second gear set or something like that if I do future tweaks on the build, but as things are, it's probably going to reflect the build as I've played it and not change too much after this. Or at the very least, things won't change outside of nerfs to the build. Now, in terms of gameplay, it feels really, really smooth, especially after doing the Hypothermia swap. Before that, I'd been doing Flame Wall, and like I said, mana was super rough, and I very much felt like I was griefing myself. So, since dropping that, it's felt great. But there are a couple times when things get a little awkward. Against small enemies, especially those with mana drain, sometimes you will push them back, pushing the mana drain onto yourself if you use Frostwall. For these, the best thing to do is really just drop a Frostbomb, drop a comet on their head to freeze them, and fireball them at point-blank range without casting the Frostwall. Against large enemies, Frostwall detonates instantly, which feels really, really good. They just get completely destroyed. And your comet charges up very frequently, and quite often, if you're doing high-density content, something like a ritual or a breach, you will fully recharge the energy for the comet and fully recharge the mana almost instantaneously. The mana will come from the comet itself, and the energy will come from the fireball right after. In general, this build does excel more in closed areas. So narrow, twisty corridors, best friend. Big open space, not quite as good, but still totally viable, as you can always use Frostwall to force the detonation on your fireballs. But in small closed spaces, you can just spam Fireball without necessarily having to use Frostwall. But speaking of, just having Frostwall is a great benefit, because on so many of the Pinnacle bosses, I was using Frostwall to block their attacks. That's right, their attacks get blocked by Frostwall, it damages the crystals, and then the enemy is sad because you drop a comet on their head, or you detonate the walls to deal massive damage and freeze them solid. In this way, not only is Frostwall a great damage move, but it's also great defensively as well, and the lower wall health doesn't seem to be too much of an issue. But one thing I have noticed is there's kind of a lot that can go wrong with this build. If you don't have enough ES, you can get chain stunned, and you can get killed. You'll feel pretty darn squishy if you have low ES, because this build's main defense is just having a massive health pool. Also, if you don't get your spirit right, you need to have 100 from the campaign, and really high rolls on both your amulet and your chest. If you don't get any of that right, you won't reach 210, which means you can't use the double auras, and you don't have happy fun times. And mana. If you don't have a mana on kill jewels, it's really rough to sustain, and you'll probably find yourself spamming that mana drain quite a lot, even though it doesn't give that much mana ultimately. It's like 200 per cast, which isn't nothing. That's like half of a fireball. The other thing that I found kind of rough was attribute requirements, which is largely because I leveled up my elemental invocation. So I highly recommend keeping this as a lower level skill. The extra like 20% energy gain isn't worth it. And one of the things I'm probably going to do in the near future as I get level 19 gems for my spell skills is just bite a bullet and spend the money to use a lower level elemental invocation instead of the level 18 or so that I have equipped currently. But who knows, maybe I'll find a ring with like 30 decks and go, never mind, it's better to just keep this as it is. Like with many problems in Path of Exile 2, you can either solve it by building differently, or you can solve it with the superpower of money. And so that's my thoughts on the build. So far, it's been really good. This started as a pivot to save my broken cast on freeze character, and it's turned into something capable of killing Pinnacle bosses, which I'm really happy about. But I also think I'm done with this particular puzzle, and I'm going to go on to try other things, such as maybe playing Archmage, since that seems to be the new hotness. If you want to know how to level this character up, I'll leave a guide down in the description from ZenM, talking about how to level Fireball Frostwall. Basically, you use that all the way through the campaign, then as you get into Endgame, start collecting Energy Shield gear, and when you have enough to get to like 4 or 5k, you swap over to CI, and you play the version of a build from my previous video. Then, as you get more gear, and as you get better gear, and as you are able to fix all of the problems like extra spirit and mana, when you feel like you're really well and truly in the endgame and doing tier 15 maps and pinnacle bosses and all that, that's when this part of the build comes together, because again, this is an endgame build, it's not something that you can do just starting out. But hopefully you should have a pretty good idea of what to do and how to do it, because I've documented my path and my progression. And so, with that said, if you're playing the build, let me know some of your thoughts and experiences down in the comments below. And if you're not playing it, let me know what you have been playing, and if that's been going well, or if you're looking for something else. For now, I'm going to get going, because I need to get back to mapping, but thanks for watching to the end, I'm glad you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.